Alright, welcome to the video lecture on Chapter 10. Chapter 10 deals with all other crimes against persons excluding murder and manslaughter. So, first learning objective in this chapter is to talk about the seriousness of rape. We generally consider this to be the second most serious offense outside of homicide. And crimes, we have four main types of crimes against persons. Taking a life, which was covered in Chapter 9, unwanted sexual invasions covered in this chapter, bodily injuries covered in this chapter, and personal restraint. So the most common example of sexual invasion is assault or rape. Bodily injury is assault, and personal restraint crimes are like kidnappings, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of rape only because it's changed dramatically. And one thing that I really want you to think about when we're talking about sexual assaults is that sexual assaults include rape, but there are other types of sexual assaults. And essentially, any unwanted touching of a sexual nature could be a sexual assault. Things like pinching someone's butt, fondling their breasts, those things, and when they are unwanted, becomes a sexual assault. So the key issue there is distinguishing what was flirting, what was welcomed, and what was not. Okay? Alright. So, we're going to start off with the crime of rape. Rape does not always result in a physical injury, but we still deem it to be one of the most serious felonies out there. Originally, we only had two sexual offenses, rape and sodomy. We have expanded that significantly over time. We have relaxed our definition of rape. We have, in part because we understand that most rape victims are raped by people that they know. So most rapes are what we would call acquaintance rapes. There is much less aggravated rape out there where you are raped by a complete stranger. So the law is moving to reflect that, but the culture and what we think of as rape is not quite caught up there yet. Now, we had major reforms to what we consider to be rape law in the 1970s and 80s. And those reforms look at the definition changed and the grading changed. So we replaced rape with sexual assault or sexual battery in some places. And we graded the amount of contact with degree. So when we talked about murder, first and second degree was really common. Well, sexual assaults also have those same degrees. So first degree usually involves sexual intercourse, forced sexual intercourse. And lesser types of touching, unwelcome touching, or lesser contact makes up those lower degrees of sexual assault. Under the common law, victims, to successfully prove rape, victims had to demonstrate that they engaged in the utmost resistance possible. So they had to demonstrate that they attempted to aggressively fight off their attacker. And even then, there are examples of women who were crawling away, screaming for help, picking up sticks and swinging at their attacker, who were not able to successfully prove that a sexual assault occurred to them. So we have changed our definition of force over time. Rape convictions used to be mandated that they be corroborated by an uninterested witness. As you can imagine, this is kind of a challenging requirement. Most rapes occur in fairly private places, and oftentimes the only people who are in the room are the accused rapist and the victim. So we have removed that corroboration requirement. Now we're going to note that that dynamic still exists. For acquaintance rapes, where there's almost never a witness and it boils down to who does the jury find to be more believable or the judge find to be more believable. In the past, the victim's sexual history was permitted, and that has changed. So victim's sexual history is not permitted unless it can be proven to show that the defendant because of a prior sexual relationship, the defendant assumed that consent still was in place. And then there is something called the marital rape exception, which provides that husbands cannot legally rape their wives. This still kind of exists in most places. In California, rape between spouses is a separate crime from stranger rape, so they have a criminal offense of marital rape, which is punished much less severely than other forms of sexual assaults and rapes. 20 states give immunity to husbands who have sex with their wives when they are unconscious or unable to consent. Marital rape is usually punished less severely than other types of rape. Sometimes if the rapist's spouse agrees to go to counseling, the prosecutor will drop charges completely. And in a few places, the prosecutor actually has a higher burden on the amount of force in order to prove that a rape occurred if the victim and defendant are married. So they have to show more. They have a higher burden. So this has been altered from never to sometimes, but this is still in our law. That's still around. It's very hard. So a common sexual assault statute looks like Michigan's. This is in the book. Defines what first degree is. It defines what sexual intercourse means, which is traditional sexual intercourse, as well as anal sex and different types of oral sex. This is commonly referred to as a blowjob, and this is commonly referred to. This is going down on a female partner. So sexual penetration is more than just traditional sex. Now we have broadened that definition. Here is the intentional touching or the clothing immediately of an intimate part. So first degree is the actual penetration, and second degree is the unwanted intentional touching. Sexual contact by force or coercion, and sexual penetration by force. So this is a very traditional modern rape statute. Now, so we've talked a little bit about the history and some changes. Let's talk about what the elements of a modern rape statute are. So, the actus reus, there needs to be, for modern rape, is that there needs to be force and resistance. The types of resistance depends on the state you live in. So some states require that there only be, so again, actus reus is sexual penetration by force or threat of force. So how do we define that force? In some states we have a reasonable resistance rule where the amount of resistance by the victim just would depend on the totality of the circumstances. Or in other words, we take it on a case-by-case basis. Utmost resistance rule requires that the defendant do anything within their power to prevent the penetration from occurring. Now this is kind of problematic because sometimes it results in the victim actually being injured more seriously than they otherwise would have been. And then the definitions of force, there are two different definitions. Extrinsic force requires the physical effort to penetrate plus something else. Okay, physical effort to penetrate plus something else. Meanwhile, intrinsic force requires just the amount of force necessary to penetrate. So this is the more lenient standard, but this is the more common one, including in Indiana. Your book then has an example that occurred from 2 college students in Pennsylvania to demonstrate extrinsic force. He kind of had his arm down, was holding her, penetrated, and that was found to be not rape. All right, let's keep moving along here. The mens rea for rape is the intent to sexually penetrate. We have a circumstance element here, which is that the victim does not consent. Okay. As far as threat of force, actual force isn't necessarily required. If you threaten your victim and they subjectively believe it, and we kind of objectively look at it and say, yeah, that's reasonable, then that can be sufficient. So brandishing a weapon satisfies this. The physical size difference, things like that, they all would go to show the threat, to show a threat of force. So mens rea here, we have a general intent crime for rape. If you intended to penetrate, you intended to use force, you have the mens rea. There is something called in a couple of states, they do have some circumstance elements that would lessen this and make more recklessness or negligence acceptable. That is not as common. That is just not as common. All right. Let's take a minute and look at a couple examples here. So my first example, Karen is a quadriplegic who after an accident is in a permanent coma at a nursing home and has been in the coma for 2 years. During a routine physical examination, it is discovered that she is pregnant. She's not married, and the nursing home director states someone is guilty of rape. Is he correct? If we think about this, sexual penetration clearly occurred for her to be pregnant, and mens rea is the intent to penetrate. So the issue here is victim non-consent, and yes, this is rape. Karen could not consent to sexual contact. It's impossible for her to consent given her physical state. So, and we'll go ahead and note that this standard also would apply to someone who's intoxicated or mentally incapacitated. Now, a second example, Don Juan wants to have sex with Camille. She refuses because they are not married. Don Juan fakes a wedding, believing the ceremony is real. Camille now agrees to have sex with Don Juan. Is Don Juan guilty of rape? Here, again, we need to think about the elements and what's going on, and Don Juan is not guilty of rape under this circumstance. Remember, unlawful intercourse with someone other than the spouse without consent. She did consent here. That fraud doesn't negate her consent. Fraud would only negate consent if it prevents the victim from knowing the true nature of the act involved. So an example of this, of a time where fraud might negate consent would be if you go in for a gynecological exam, you think that you're getting, you're there for an exam, and they tell you that they're going to insert an instrument, and it's actually a body part. That is a time where fraud negated your consent. You consented to a medical procedure, not to rape. Okay? Alright, we're going to go ahead and pause this video here, and I'm going to pick up with statutory rape and assault and battery in the next recording.